Oh, okay.
But they just worked with those terrorists, but not with college students or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of died down. There was an African who was sort of the key man for those who came to Christ at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so Waldron said, "Why don't you and Jeri go over and get to work with university students?" And he says, "If you don't want to, you come here to Lebanon and let me go." And I said, well, I prayed about it, and so it's a kind of a long story, but they sent me over to spy out the land to see what the possibilities would be.
Mm-hmm.
So I took 3 weeks and went over and went to several places in Africa, and people were happy to have us come, and that's how we got started.
So, Jim, how do they get you prepared to go overseas like that? I mean, I know I heard that story about Roy Robertson, and Dawes sent him to China. But how did they prepare you? I mean, you're going to a place that's...
See, I met the Navigators when I went to Baylor in 1952.
Right.
But I mainly was studying at that time, but I met Dawson Trotman at a weekend conference north of Dallas in 53, and I was so impressed with him that then I went out to California to a place outside of down south there, and
San Diego?
Huh?
Was it San Diego?
No, north of San Diego. It was out east of Los Angeles.
Okay.
And it was a big, not too far, but it was a large. In fact, I think the one I went to was a Campus Crusade conference, because the Navigators had put 4 of our staff to help Bill Bright get Campus Crusade started at UCLA.
Mm.
And so that conference was to bring the converts. And at that time, the Navigators and Crusade had that conference, and Doss was there.
Yeah.
And I got personal time with him. And,
how much time did you get with him?
Well, I'll tell you a funny story. There were about 400 or 500 of us there at that. And in the days when Dawson Trotman spoke, there were several of us that came early and put our Bibles down on the first 3 rows there so we could get as close to that man as we could.
Mm.
And so they said, anybody would like to have time with Doss, let us know, and I did. And so they had me come to his cabin early one morning, and I had time with him. And but Skip Gray and Leroy Imes and yeah, there were 4 of them that were loaned for the year of 1952 and 3 to help Bill Bright get that ministry started.
Yeah.
And so I had heard of the Navigators, and I went back and all the way through my sophomore year and junior year and senior year, I was involved with the Navigators. we had a Navigator conference in my senior year, I think it was, up north of Dallas, and we had 2 busloads of students from Baylor going up there to hear Doss speak. So I had a lot of training with them, and as soon as I graduated from Baylor, I got into Dallas Seminary, because the man who had mentored me the most at Baylor was Lyman Coleman. And Lyman was in Dallas. Well, and so I enrolled there and had a car accident and later had to leave, and it's kind of a long story, but I remember going to a motel one weekend because I had to drop out of Dallas Seminary because that car accident I had, it took them so long to get me a car that I got in debt. I was living in Skip Gray's NAB home there in Dallas. So I went and prayed, and I thought, well, Doss Trotman thought maybe I'd like to go into the military for a couple of years, and that was one possibility. Another one was to try to get back into Dallas Seminary. And then the Navigators had said, well, we'd like you to come up to our training program. So I prayed, and I spent the whole weekend, and I had a book and pencil, and I was putting the pros and cons of each of those 3, and it was pretty equal. And so I was praying, Lord, which one should I do? And I got down on my knees, and I heard his voice say, pick one. And I said, Lord, I don't want to pick one. I want you to pick one. And he said, well, you pick one and trust that I'm in it. So I said, okay, Lord, I'm going to do it. And I picked the Navigators. And I said, okay, God, I'm going to do that. But if you're not in it, you stop me, because if you don't, I'm not looking back.
Yeah.
And so on New Year's Eve, 1958, I arrived at Glen Eyrie, and Doss Trotman was there, and Lauren Sanny, and we had just gotten Glen Eyrie, and in 1954 was the first conference they ever had there, and I went up for that. I was a student at Baylor, and went up, and then there's no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, just that castle. And so it's interesting, we didn't have enough chairs down on the kitchen dining area and for the meeting room up in Great Hall. You've been to Glen Eyrie, haven't you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So we would have the chairs all down in the dining hall, and then a crew of us. Skip was the kind of the song leader and MC for the meetings, and so he had a team of us, and after breakfast we'd move all the chairs up to the dining and to the Great Hall. Then after the morning we'd move them down for lunch, and then we would usually no afternoon meeting, but then we would have the, at dinner, we'd have the chairs back, and we worked both ways. And I remember one of those nights, we were moving the chairs up there, and Skip Gray looked at his watch, and he said, okay, men, it's 7:10. 20 minutes before the evening meeting starts. Just time to go out and prepare your heart for the evening meeting. And I'd been a Christian about 8 years, but I'd never thought about preparing my heart before going into a meeting. But I went out, and there was no patio at that time, just some grass out there. I went out and did that, and then that night, somebody said, Doss, how do you become a navigator? And Doss looked over at me. I was over about 2 rows back, and he said, Jim White, you tell these people how you can become a navigator. And I thought, oh my goodness, I don't know. So I stood up and I said, well, Doss, I guess you just start navigating. And he said, that's it. That's it. You just do that.
Oh yeah. Well, you have remembered that.
Yeah. But I got there to work there on New Year's Eve, 1957. And 6 months later, Jeri moved there from Los Angeles with all the girls. Skip Gray had gone out to California and closed down the women's work and sent them all to Glen Eyrie. And Jeri was out there in that girls' NAB home. And that's how I met her. But we had a no dating policy at the Glen because we're there for training and to help in conferences, and we'd have to mow lawns and then come be a discussion leader. And so the NAB said, no dating. Well, that was really a great idea because we would, when we just had the staff, we'd have maybe 3 or 4 women around the table with us, and we got to know them without dating. And then at the end of, or at the beginning of 1959, Lord Sanny came to me and he said, are you interested in any girl? And I said, well, you know, that girl, Jeri Davis, that was here for about a year, and she's now working in the Pentagon. I think she'd make a good wife. And he says, well, why don't you write her a letter? Let's see where it goes. And so we did, and then she was coming out for a conference. Have I told you this before?
Yeah, you may have. I don't know.
Well, anyway, I won't go into the details. But anyway, we got engaged, and Lauren tied the knot on April 2nd, 1961. So we've been married 61 years when Jeri died.
Wow. Yeah.
But I look back and I think it was a great journey.
Yeah.
We took Leroy Adams' place at the University of Nebraska when he became the U.S. director. And following Leroy, I told people that the NAV contacts on that campus said, Jesus I know, and Leroy I know, but Jim White, who are you? Man, I thought I was in over my head, but we finally got going in it, and then we moved to Washington, D.C., and Gene Tabor had left to go become a missionary in the Philippines over there, and so the Navigators sent me over to take his place, and boy, he had their hearts over there. And when we got there, it was Jesus I know and Gene Tabor I know, but who are you?
You start all over again.
But finally, the Lord helped, and then it was in the summer of 1965 that that Walter Scott asked me to go survey Africa. And I was over there 3 weeks. That we had gone there when the Mau Mau were under control, and so that several navigators had gone for that, but not a university ministry. And so I went over and came back and wrote a 75-page report of what I learned over there in the 3 weeks that I was in East Africa. Mm. And then I remember Lawrence Sanney calling me and saying, we want to open a work and we're not going to make you go, but if you would, we would like to send you. So I went to Jeri and I said, Jeri, I need to go away for a weekend and pray about this. Yeah. And she said, well, we've got 2 little children and I don't have anybody to leave them with, but you go and fast and pray, and whatever God says to you, we'll do it. Mm. So I came back and I told her God wants us to go, and she says, well, let's pack. And we took everything that we were going to take to Africa in 6 of these big barrels.
Wow.
We didn't have boxes and things. We got those barrels from some places and put all our clothes and utensils and everything in there. So it was a great journey.
Wow. So did you go by boat then?
No, we flew.
You flew, okay.
We flew first of all to England to see Doug and his the guy in charge of all of Europe, Doug Sparks.
Doug Sparks, yeah.
And then we went over to Germany to see a couple that had, he was a general in the Air Force, and he had been very close to us in Washington, D.C. We were there. Mm-hmm. So he was then in charge of all of the Air Force in Western Europe, and we went and spent 3 or 4 days with him and his wife. And then we flew over to Beirut, Lebanon, and that's where Scotty was and the Navigators, and visited them, and then we headed down to Nairobi, and the rest is history.
So how did you start the work there?
Excuse me a minute. Well, that was an interesting story because when we got there, we went to a meeting of professors that were interested in the campus ministry. Mm. And most of them were from Great Britain. They were British.
Okay.
And so I showed up at this meeting, and I said, they said, well, what are you doing over here? And I said, well, I think the Navigators want me to have a university ministry here. And they said, well, we already have a university ministry. Oh my goodness. There was an organization that was a good organization. And they said, we already have this, and so we don't need you here. And then this professor spoke up and said, I think we do need Jim White here, because he had been in the London Billy Graham meetings in London when the Navigators trained the counselors and all that, and he gave that report of what the Navigators do, and they said, okay, the Navigators can come have a ministry on this campus.
Wow.
So that's what our work was, and even while we were there, we one of our Africans got transferred over to Uganda, to the campus over there, and there had never in the history of that campus had there been an evangelical emphasis at the university. And so I went over to visit him, and he really came alive, and he was winning. He was going all through the dorm, giving his testimony. Actually, I had met him one night in Nairobi in the dorm, and I was meeting with this new Christian, and this new Christian had taken a bus to come to one of our NAV conferences out north of Nairobi, and he was crippled, but he was walking, and we saw him, asked him where he was going, and gave him a ride. So when we got back from that conference, I wanted to spend some man-to-man time with him, and we were sitting there and going over it, and then this African comes in, and he's half drunk. And he wanted to know, what are you doing and all this, see?
Right.
And I prayed, oh God, how in the world do I do this? And so a little time went by, and I told him, gave him the gospel. And he just got up and got down on his knees. And I looked over at my crippled friend, and we got down on our knees as he received Christ. This drunk guy, he was sobering up. And I later found out he went out and walked all around the campus for 3 hours, praising God for the new life God had given him. Well, then he was transferred over to Uganda, and I went over to see him. And as a result of him, he went through the dorm giving his testimony, and people were pouring out, and we saw a lot of them coming to Christ through him. So anyway, you got more details than you need.
Oh, I love hearing the stories, Jim. They're wonderful to hear that.
Well, I look back and I think, how in the world did that happen? It was God.
Exactly.
It was God.
Yeah.
And then the work got to where we had other staff coming into Nairobi and also into Uganda, and it got to be something that was where they were planning to invade several countries in Africa, and that's where I really, really didn't fit.
Oh. And
the Navs sent another man out to take my place, and he was there not quite a year, and because he was allergic to the main food out there, they only left him for a year. And then he left, and another guy came, and he left, and then a guy came that stayed about 12 years and really got the work going. So I came back, and the Navigators let me work with George Sanchez for 5 years. And he trained me to be a staff counselor.
Yeah.
So I began to travel all over the U.S. meeting with NAV families and marriage counseling and with their kids and all that.
And your family was falling apart.
So that's how it happened. I told you far more than you needed to hear.
Oh, no. Well, Jim, so when you are helping guys get started, when you go to, what did you start helping them do?
Well, I wanted to make sure that they understood what it meant to be a Christian.
Okay. And how did you do that?
I took them through, let's see where it is.
Is it the Lessons on Assurance?
Exactly.
That's what I use.
It's got a new cover today.
Yeah.